Now, when we consider all the crazy things that we see in the headlines every day, all the violent things, just things that are just over the top crazy, how do we wrap our minds around it? And there's a number of different ways to look at it. Now, from a Christian perspective, we're taught as Christians to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, okay? So that has to do with discipline. It has to do with life experience, and it has to do with what we read in the Bible, what we're taught from the Bible. Now, we have to admit that every one of us have thoughts that come in our head that we often go, wow, where'd that come from? Or things that'll pop up that maybe have happened to us in our childhood, or, whether it be negative or positive. And all these things are things that we have to take control of. We have to have a certain amount of discipline. Now, if you're raised in a church or in a church environment, obviously your worldview is going to have guidelines, biblical guidelines, for the most part. And the idea of turn the other cheek and love your neighbor and all that business, right? But suppose you weren't raised in a church environment and you come out of maybe a violent childhood, or some other unstable environment to where you were taught things that were just, maybe a gang mentality. You grew up in a gang environment. And to some degree, gangs become like a family. And so, depending on what kind of guidelines they have for their gang, is going to be the way you think. And then, suppose you're raised in a Muslim environment. For example, there's one whole chapter of the Quran, chapter 8, it's entitled The Spoils. And the whole chapter has to do with conflict and subduing your enemies through jihad. And then it gives you a rationale. It gives you a supposed rational reason for believing that it's okay to steal your neighbor's goods, to pillage your neighbor's stuff, right? So now, if you've been taught that, whether you believe it or not, if you've been taught that, it's still in your head. And so if you see somebody else pillaging your neighbor's goods, you're going to think, well, I'm not going to get involved. I mean, after all, that's what's in the Quran, right? You see a Muslim pillaging a non-Muslim's goods, or taking advantage of them in some way or another, chances are you're going to stay on the neutral side of things. You're not going to get involved. And then consider this, that the Bible talks a lot, especially in the Gospels, especially Mark's Gospel. The very first chapter, I believe, you see a situation in the synagogue where there's a guy who has an unclean spirit, a demon, okay? And he pipes up, and Jesus has to address that. So, that would be like, somebody popping off in church, right? And then you fast forward to the 5th chapter of Mark's Gospel, and you see a story about a guy who he lives in the tombs, and he's so violent that it says they can't contain him with chains. He breaks the chains, okay? Now, in our world today, we see more and more of people living on the streets, and oftentimes their brains have been twisted through drug abuse or some kind of abuse, one thing or another. Sexual abuse, whatever. There's a long list of things that can happen to twist people's brains around. But drugs is probably one of the biggest players in our environment. And once you get involved in drug abuse, whether it be pharmaceutical drugs or even alcohol, it changes the way your brain functions. And your guidelines for reasoning are not like the rest of society. And there's a place in the Bible that describes a person's mind as a city with walls. Now, back in the old days, cities had walls, kind of like the Vatican today, you know. But once a city no longer has walls, the enemy could just come and go. And that's what happens when you get involved in drugs. The drugs chisel away at your natural defenses in your brain, changes your brain chemistry. And then eventually what happens is the old devil can just come in and play tricks on you. He can actually speak through you. Now, the sad part about it is a lot of Christians today, they will recite the Lord's Prayer, but if you ask them if they've ever seen a demon cast out, they would say, well, either that's not for today, or, you know, we've never been taught that, or, you know, it doesn't happen in our church, or whatever. But there's an interesting line in the Lord's Prayer that says, deliver us from evil, in one version. Other versions say, deliver us from the evil one. Now, that could be looked at from a couple different ways. I mean, it's one thing to be delivered from evil, maybe be delivered from evil neighbors, maybe, or delivered from your neighbor's evil dog, right? Or be delivered from the evil one, as in the devil. And the devil, if you believe the Bible at all, you have to keep in mind the little book of Job, right, in the Old Testament. I mean, the very first couple of chapters shows a picture of the devil harassing Job, stealing all of his goods, destroying all of his crops, and eventually killing his kids, and then stirring up his wife against him. You know, she says basically, if this God is so great, you know, with this mess that you're going through, you ought to curse God and die, right? And now, we've all been in situations where you've been involved in some kind of conflict where somebody pops off with a statement that they regret, right? And under the pressure that Job was in and his wife was in, you know, I can understand how she could say such a thing. And so these are some of the ways that we can maybe understand the society that we live in today. I mean, somebody that's been raised in, say, the Mormon church, for example, that they've been taught that they're going to become a god, and they're working to that end, right? And then they've been given this kind of a superiority complex, that they believe they're better than everybody else that claims to be a Christian because they have a better revelation, see, a more up-to-date revelation. And then maybe they've got a temple recommend, and they've been to the temple, and they've called the power of the priesthood down upon them. Okay, well, let's suppose that power is real, and the spirit of Mormonism begins to take control of your brain. Now, I recall a story years ago by Ed Decker. Ed Decker was an ex-Mormon who wrote a number of books, spoke out against Mormonism for most of his life. And he talked about an experience where he was speaking to a Christian church. This was probably not long after he got converted to Christianity and got delivered of his Mormon thing. And he got to thinking while he was speaking to this crowd that he had called down the power of the priesthood on him, and I think it says something to the effect down to the third or fourth generations. Well, he renounced that publicly before this congregation, and later when he went home, his wife said, wow, a couple of our kids just went ballistic this evening. And he got to thinking, well, what time did that happen? And they compared notes, and come to find out it happened about the time that he renounced that curse that he called down on himself. So there are spiritual things that affect us. I mean, I've had Mormons tell me when I've had Mormons come to the house, and when I began to challenge them, I've had one Mormon kid say, I knew this place was evil when I came in here because the spirit wouldn't come in this house. Well, that's because I prayed before they came that the spirit of Mormonism could not come in my house. See, so Now, we have power as Christians. We have authority, but a lot of Christians don't realize that we have power and authority. And they pray these general prayers. They'll pray the Lord's Prayer, but it really doesn't mean much to them. It's just something they do every Sunday by rote. And so they don't really understand the significance of each line in that prayer. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up because of all the insane things. I mean, we see people being assassinated in our country. Now, people have been assassinated in our country since the very beginning. So that's not all that unusual. However, it's happening more and more as we see time progress here. And now, here we see things going on over in Israel with Hamas. And how do you explain some of these things? I mean, the evil that's required for governments to have to go to war against a whole society that's bent on driving them into the sea and killing them. I mean, it's insane. It's not a whole lot different than what Germany was dealing with, in 1938 up till the days of Adolf Hitler taking control. The hatred that had been fostered against the Jews. Now, I mean, we're all programmed in different ways. We're programmed through our schools, and that's another problem in our society today. We're taught really to not have any critical thinking. If you do have any critical thoughts, they boot you out of school. I mean, I know from experience. My wife and I have been involved in public schools a little bit, and if you challenge the LGBTQ crowd, they will quickly try to figure out a way to get you out of your job. This is some of the things that we're dealing with, and we have a job as Christians to pray, not only for ourselves, but to pray for other people, pray that they would get delivered from their deception, and pray for our country, because our country is in bad shape. I mean, with the Biden administration, we had 4 years. Of course, we had quite a few years before that with the previous administration opening the doors to Islam. And so now we got Muslim mosques all over the United States. And the way Islam works is usually they're pretty passive until they get to a position where they think they have enough control in the political realm, and then they get more involved. And so these are some things that we need to speak out against. And, we need to be more evangelistic. I harp on that quite a bit because that's pretty much my calling, is confronting issues. And so we're the salt of the earth, and it's time for the salt to start doing what it's supposed to do. Give flavor to society and prevent corruption. Thank you very much.